Hi and welcome to this DCP-Ware Blender Particle beginner's tutorial. So in today's tutorial I want to give you just a basic understanding of how particles work in Blender. So we'll load up Blender here, we'll click on General. We've got a camera, we've got a light source, and we've got this cube. Let's just go to File, Save As, like we usually do, and I've got a directory on my computer. I'm just going to call this Blender Beginners-01. So let's just look at basically how particles work in Blender. Then you can start getting used to them. You can start experimenting after you finish this tutorial. You should get a good understanding of how particles work. So let's middle mouse click and pan around to the side. And we've got a cube here. So we could basically, you can create particles from mesh-based objects. So let's say we've got a square here and we want to emit some particles from it. It doesn't matter really what the actual object is. All we do is click on the object and go to the particle settings here, click particles, and then we click the plus sign here. I'm using the latest version of Blender, so you want to download the latest 2.8 beta version, and some of the things have changed in here slightly, so you want to make sure you're using the latest version. So we click the plus sign and then click the play button. You'll see particles start to emit. Now what most people get confused with is they see these particles coming out, and when they press F12 to render, so if the camera's looking down at the cube, right, so if we press 0, you can see these little particles here. We press F12 to render and all you see is a cube and no particles. So you're wondering why that is. These little dots or these little circles, if you look inside of the render settings here for the particle emitter, they're called halos, and they're just basically like placeholders, right? They're not really something that gets rendered out in the actual final render. So you have to actually create the particle yourself. So let's go ahead and create a basic particle. Let's just press Shift A and we insert a UV sphere. So we've got a UV sphere here. We click on the move tool and we just drag that up so we can see it here. So we can make this a particle. So all these little dots will become this, basically this UV sphere here. So if we want to do that, normally we'd add some sort of color to it. Let's add at least a color to it. So we'll click on the UV sphere here. We'll go down to the material. We'll click new material and we'll just change the color just so that we can see the color in here. And we'll go to our render view, right? So in the render view, we haven't got much lighting in here, but we've got at least a light source. And we want to make this blue UV sphere, these little dots, these little particles coming out. So let's click on the square or the cube and we'll go back to the particle emitter. And inside of the render settings here, you'll see object. So if we click object, now it says instance of object, and we can click the sphere. Now you can see all the little spheres being emitted, and these will render out. So if you press F12, you'll see the little spheres getting rendered out, right? Now sometimes you don't really want the cube to be shown in the render. We call this the emitter. So when you click on an object and you're emitting particles from it, we call that object the emitter. And if you go down to the render settings here, underneath object, you can say, where is it? Sorry, underneath these settings here, where you selected object, you can see the show emitter. You can turn it off. Now inside of the viewport, it will still display because you want to see that object as you're working. But when you go to press F12 and render, you will no longer see the square or the cube. You'll just see the particles on their own. So if you don't want to see them in the viewport, then there's viewport settings here. You see viewport settings, and you can turn off show emitter here. Now you will only see the particles, and you won't actually see the cube in the viewport or in the render. So that's basically how particles are working in Blender. Then you can do loads of other things to these particles to make them look more fancy. You can do loads of good stuff. So for instance, we could click on the emitter or the actual particle up here. We can go to its settings and we can go to turn it to emission shader. So now it's going to have some light coming from it. So let's say we set the emission to like 5, right? We set it to 5 and then we'll change the color to a light blue sort of color. Now these particles are light blue. But normally in the render, when you final render, you don't really want this object to be seen. You just want the particles to be seen, right? So the camera is looking down at the particles. It doesn't see this object up here. We just move it out of the camera view because we only want to see the particles here. So if we go over to the render settings and turn on bloom, now these particles will start to glow because they're in emission shader. So they're emitting light. You can think of it that way. And if we turn the threshold down and we turn the knee down and we turn the radius right down, Let's turn the intensity down. In fact, we should turn the threshold up a little bit. We can increase the radius. Now these particles will start to glow. Really, we've got, this is not the best background color, this gray color. So really we should go to the world settings in here, click on color, and we can just make it black. Now you can see like they're like neon glowing particles. So if we press F12 and render, you'll see the particles like this. Now sometimes in Blender, when you're animating these particles, and let's say that you can see the particles, let's press 0. So this is exactly what the camera sees at the moment, right? And if we press F12, it will render out fine. But when your particles start to get more complex, so let's say if we went to the particle system, we click on the cube here, and we start to set the settings up to a much higher number, like 50,000, right? Blender's going to struggle, not struggle, depending on your machine, but it's going to struggle to remember where all of these particles are supposed to be displayed. And as you're scrubbing through here, it might break a little bit because it can't work it out. You press F12, and you're not really expecting this at this point in time. So what we need to do is tell Blender to what we call bake the particles, right? So if we go back to the first frame, and if we go to the cache settings here and say bake, or click bake all dynamics, Blender will memorize where all of those 50,000 particles are going to be in this space. So if we start to move across now, it doesn't matter where we move, the particles will emit, right, in the correct location. If we move to any random frame and press F12, we'll see those particles in that exact same location. So always remember, when you're doing complex particles, you want to bake, right? Bake all dynamics. Now once you've baked it, it's almost memorized. Blend, so you can see you can move through this quite fast, and it will just memorize it and know where those particles are going. But sometimes we want to change things, and when you change stuff, you all of a sudden you're not seeing it reflected in the animation. It's because you need to delete the bake. So we hit delete bake, and then it will free the bake. We call it free in the bake or delete the bake. When we go back to the first frame and play it, Blender has deleted that, but it's kind of memorized it until you make some dramatic change to it, right? So let's make a change to it. First of all, I'm going to pan around to the side here, and I'm going to zoom out a little bit, and I'm going to press Ctrl-Alt-0 to get the camera into this sort of view, like this, and we can see the particles flowing out now, right? So we could press F12, and we should see that sort of shape of the particles flowing out. But let's do something to these particles. So there's quite a few different things you can do here. You can, let's just save this. Let's go back to the first frame. So on the first frame, we don't really see any particles. But inside the settings here, you can start to play around with the settings to see what they do. And I'm going to explain some of the basic ones, right? So let's click play. And when we click play, we can go down to the field weights here. We can change the gravity. So if we change the gravity, if we turn off the gravity, you can see that Blender, normally gravity is going to push things down, right? So gravity will always have an effect on making the objects move in a downwards direction, you could say, right? So the less gravity we have, if we turn the gravity off, for example, the particles are just going to flow in their natural direction. So that each one of the faces on the box, so if we went back to the, let's see, the viewport, and if we turned back on the show emitter, each one of these faces on the box itself is emitting particles. The particles get emitted from the face of the object, right? So you can see when we turn off the show emitter, you can almost see that sort of square object, especially in the early points, right? Like here, you can see the square element as it's emitting the particles from the face. So here you can see the particles only get so far. If we go back and play, you'll see the particles will stop to emit here, right at this point here, equally around the edges. This is called the lifetime of the particle. So here you can see lifetime is set to 50 frames. So the particles start to emit on the first frame, and they stop emitting on frame 200. So if we reduce this lifetime right down to something like 12, you can see now they're going to emit, they're going to die off. We call this like the particle lifetime. So they won't last as long, basically, right? But if we increase this to something like 250, now the particles are going to last a lot longer, and they're going to flow out a lot further from that object that's emitting it, because we've given it more lifetime. Something like that. I'm going to reduce the amount of particles because this is quite a lot for Blender to work on in real time. So we'll set it to something like 10,000. So 10,000 should be fine. It should be able to bake this all out in real time, and we can see everything happening in real time. So normally what happens is if you pause something and you move across the timeline, you can scrub through it, right? But if you make a change, let's say we play and we change something here, it will sort of stutter, and then you have to wait for it to get back to the beginning to see that effect there, right? So normally what I would do is set it to less frames. So it's on 250. Normally I'll set it to like 150 frames, so it loops back a bit quicker. So while I'm making changes and adjustments to the particles, it will loop back and I can see what's happening a lot quicker. So let's set this back to 10,000 particles. And let's scroll down to here, and we've got scale here. So we can randomize the scale. At the moment, it's half of the, it's like 0. If we set this to 1, the particles are going to be exactly the same size as the original object, right? So if we set this to something like 0.5, now they're going to be half the size of this original object. They're half the size, 0.5. If we set it to 0.05, let's do 0.005. The particles are going to be really, really small, right? They're going to be like a fraction of the original size. You can see that, right? So the sizing here will affect the size of the particles in here. And there's two ways to really affect the particle size. If we set it to something like 0.01, we could actually click on this object and press S to scale and scale that object, and that will affect the size of these particles as well that are being emitted. So if you make this object bigger, these particles will become bigger. But normally I would set the circle to its default size. So the default size is going to be scales 111 all the way across. Then go to the particle emitter, click on the cube here, and inside the particle settings for the size, the scale, here you can adjust it to whatever size you want. And then what I normally do is set some randomization here. So now the particles, normally what I would do is turn off the overlays. So when you turn off overlays, you won't see these little sort of rounded circles around the particles. So you can see things a bit clearer now, right? You can see the particles are of different sizes. If I were to pause it, you'll see some are big and some are small, and I kind of like that sort of randomization of it a bit, right? Now, inside of the, I'm not going to explain everything in here, but I'll explain some of the things that I use quite frequently. So let's look at something like the physics. And inside the physics, you've got Brownian, right? And this will kind of randomize the trajectory of the particles. So we set this to something like 5. You'll see the particles will start to move away in these random directions. And now you haven't got this like square rigid shape, right? You've got some randomization of the particles now. You can see that, right? So we can do loads of different things. We can set drag here as well, and that will sort of slow down the particles as they're moving. And it's worth really reading up on Blender manual like exactly what these settings are doing, because there's so many of them to try and understand what they're all doing. And normally I learn a lot of this stuff just by experimenting. So let's click on this little, let's just pause this. It's kind of bothering me, this circle here. So let's grab it and let's drag it right up to the top here somewhere. So it's out of the way of the camera now, or the viewport. We can click play and then let's pause it. There's a rewind button and a play forward button, right? So we want to play forward here. We can start experimenting with these particles. So there's something called force fields. So if we press Shift A, we can go to force fields and we can set something like a vortex, right? So when we click vortex, not much is going to happen because this vortex doesn't have much strength. But if we go to this, where is it called? It's called field here. So normally I rename these, right? So I'll rename it to like VORTEX, vortex. I'll give it a sensible name. It's called vortex. And I can go to the physics settings here, and then I can increase the strength. Now you can see what the vortex is doing, right? It's going to almost like make these particles rotate around the middle of that vortex. So now you can get some sort of movement in the particles in this circular sort of shape. Now is a good time to really increase the amount of frames, because now you can see what's going on. And now you kind of almost got this sort of nice sort of particle galaxy sort of effect. I think we've got too many particles, so let's go back to our cube, click on the particle settings, and we'll reduce it to something like 5,000, and then we can turn off our overlays again, and now we can see what's going on a little bit clearer. You've got this nice sort of effect, right? You can play around with these settings. Now sometimes we don't want one color, we want many colors in our particles, maybe 2, 3, 4 different colors. And how do we go about doing that? Because at the moment, we've told the particle system to use one single object up here. So what we'll do is turn our overlays back on. Let's turn the overlays back on. Click on this little blue this little blue sphere, and we'll press Shift D to duplicate. Shift and in fact, yeah, let's press Shift D to duplicate, and we're going to make 3 of them, right? So there's one here, and we press Shift D again and hit the Enter key to make 3 of them. So now we've got 3 spheres, and you can see the 3 spheres here. We'll click on this one. This is like the middle one. We'll leave one blue color. We'll go back down to the material, and we need to remove this material. So we'll click the minus here, and we're going to create a new material, and we'll set that one to an emission shader. We'll set it to 5 as well, and this time we'll leave it as white. We'll just leave it as default white. We'll click on the second sphere here, or the third one. In fact, it's the third one, right? The first object's always named sphere. The ones that you replicate or put 0, 1 and 0, 2 there. So really this is the third one. And we'll click on the minus button here as well to remove this material from this object. We'll click new, and we'll go back to the emission shader, and this time we'll pick something like a purple color, and we'll set it to 5 as well, so they've all got the same sort of power, strength of emission. Now, how do we get all of these 3 to work in this particle system? What we need to tell Blender is to take these from a collection. So you can see that as default when you load up Blender, here's a collection. So a collection is just it's almost like almost think of it like layers in Photoshop or some other sort of software, right? So we can create a new collection. Normally what I do is create a collection within this collection. So I'll right click here, and I'll right click and I'll say collection, new collection here, new. So you can see there's a new collection now, and I'll double click on it and call it particles, because that's what's going in there. And I'll click on this particle and I'll drag it into that collection. This one here. We'll click this one and drag it in here as well, and we'll click this one and drag it in here as well. And then normally I'll click on this top collection here, just to make sure that's the one that's being used at the moment, right? So if I create more objects, they'll go into the top collection. So the whole point of creating this particle collection is now we can isolate it, and we can tell Blender to use these spheres inside here within the particle emitter down here. So if we zoom in and we go back to the cube, and really we should rename this cube. We should rename it particle emitter. That's what it is. It is a cube, but it's really a particle emitter. So we call it particle emitter. We'll go back to the particle settings, and remember we told it in the render. So let's look at the render. We told it to render an object. We're going to go back there and tell it to render a collection this time, collection. And when we select that collection, there's an option here, instance collection, and we tell it to render the particles. Now you can see all of the colors in there. We go back, click play. Now we've got all of these colors. Let's turn off our overlay. Now you can see all of the 3 different colors, and you can randomize this. So you can say pick random, and you can do loads of different stuff in here. You can randomize the scale. We've already randomized the scale a bit here already, right? But now we've got this effect going. Now we've got multiple particles in different colors, and they're randomly picked. You've got this nice little effect here. This, you've learned quite a lot quite quickly, right? So normally what I would do to experiment, we can do some other things, right? So let's have a little play around. Let's turn back on our overlay, so we can see our overlay here. And at the moment, we've got this vortex in the middle. So let's press Shift A, and we can insert another force field. And we want to insert a wind object. Here's wind. And if we look carefully, you'll see there's a new field that's been added. We've got vortex here, and now we've got, normally I leave the word field here, and then I call it field wind, right? And then vortex, I'll call it field vortex. So they stack together like this, and then I know which one's which and where it's located. If I click on field wind and then pause this a second, and in fact what I'll do is I'll click here and drag it out so you can see it. So this is the field wind here. It doesn't really matter too much from what I can see where it's positioned inside of the viewport. It kind of has the same effect regardless whether it's sitting on the side or in the middle or wherever it is. It doesn't really matter. I think that's correct, right? Because if I click the vortex and drag that one out and then click play, although it's positioned over here, the particles, let's see. So it does seem to have an effect, okay? Well, actually, that might be the wind doing that, pushing it this direction, right? Around this vortex. So let's pause this. I'll press Ctrl Z and put the vortex back in the middle and click play and see if it still has that same effect. So it does. So it actually does matter where the vortex is positioned. So that's my bad. Where the vortex is located will affect how these particles will travel, but let's have a little play anyway. Let's move the vortex over to here and click play, and we can see the particles now start to travel in this direction, and I believe it's the vortex is pulling the particles into that direction, right? It's pulling it around in this circular path like this. You can see the vortex here. So if I were to go to the wind object, let's click on this wind object, I can now tell the wind to point, right now it's pointing upwards, right? So you can see the particles are traveling in an upwards direction. But if I click on the physics settings for the strength here, for the wind here, so I click wind, go to the physics settings and increase the strength, now you can see the particles will flow up a lot quicker. So the vortex won't have much effect on it because these particles are moving much faster. But we can slow that down a little bit. And what we'll do is we can actually rotate this wind object to point in the direction where this this vortex is, right? So all we do is click on the wind object, go to the settings here, and we want to rotate it on the, let's see, on the y-axis. So on the y-axis, we'll rotate it to face the vortex at 90 degrees. Now these particles are getting pushed in this direction, and they're going to flow around this vortex, but the vortex doesn't have much strength. You see it's bending, right? But this vortex doesn't have a lot of strength to it. So we go back to the vortex, click here and give it a lot more strength. Now you can see the particles are going to flow around the vortex like this. It's almost moving in this sort of direction. So you can do some really crazy stuff with particles, right? Do some pretty cool stuff. The inflow inwards component of the vortex force. So let's see. So this will really like kind of slow down these particles. You really got to experiment. I haven't read up a huge amount in the manual, but we can like change this inflow of how it's going to affect these particles and how they're going to move. So I'm setting out a minus value now, right? So you can see there's a much bigger gap around the particles. We can almost see like a cylinder inside as it's gathering them up into this position. So hopefully that's making a lot of sense. You can now go and experiment with this. There's a couple of other things we can do. So we can set the inflow back to 0. So we can see the particles just flowing this way like this, right? We can insert another force field, and we'll insert one that I use quite often is the turbulence. So we've got a turbulence one now, and it's not having much effect. So we call this field TUR for turbulence. And then we'll go to the physics settings for the turbulence, and we can increase the strength here. And now you can see these particles will start to sort of randomly flow away. But this wind is quite powerful, right? It's pushing the particles quite fast. So let's go back to the wind object, go to its settings, and we'll reduce its power. And you can see like the circles like increase like this. We can give it a lot of strength, right? And that's almost like pushing quite hard. But let's reduce that right down to like 0.6. And now you can see the sort of effect that you're getting. And if we were to position our camera, Control Alt 0, so over here somewhere, and maybe we would, let's go to the camera, right? Let's go to the camera, let's go to the camera settings, and then on the x-axis, if we were to move it across a little bit to somewhere like here, you won't really see the particles getting emitted from the side. So if I were to press F12 and render, you won't see those particles getting emitted. You would just see the effect here of the particles flowing in. And this is really where I was talking about baking. Because if you try and render, if I try and render something like this, for example, let's press F12. Look at all the particles over here, right? Press F12. You'll see them actually. It isn't too bad. It's actually rendering out pretty well, to be fair. But if we were to increase the number, let's go to our particle emitter, particle settings. We were to increase this to like 20,000. 20,000. That's the Brownian. That's the wrong setting. Let's set that back to 5. The settings are up here. So 20, 1, 2, 3, 20,000. Let's try now. Do we have to pause here? Let's see if it will render out quickly. It still seems to render out fine. So that's quite surprising. Normally you need to bake this. It's worth baking anyway. Just click Bake All Dynamics. Those get memorized in Blender now. So as you're scrubbing through your timeline, Blender will know exactly where each one of these particles should be positioned in this little scene, this little animation, right? So that's quite interesting what we've done there so far. I mean, it's not amazing by any means, but we're trying to just learn some basics of creating these particles. You can use this sort of technique to create some sort of like galaxy with stars floating around a star or something, right? All of these could have been little stars and stuff like that. The vortex is what's going to make those particles float around this object, which could be like a little galaxy sort of scene. That's how they created a lot of these galaxy sort of stuff that you see on these videos. They're just particles floating around some sort of object, right? But being controlled in the right way. That's all it is. It's all about controlling them, right? So what else can we do? We can go back to our... in fact, what we can do is click play here. So you can think we can control the particles in two different ways. We can add force fields by pressing Shift A and adding one of these force fields. There's loads of different ones in here that you can go and experiment with. Or we can actually control the particles by the particle emitter itself here. So when we change the setting in here, we need to delete the bake first, and we can do things like change the frames, change the randomness lifetime, right? So we can set this, normally I set this to quite low, so something like 0.0, something like 0.2. And now you can see Blender's struggling a little bit, right, to render out all these 20,000 particles. It's going to start to slow down and your frame rate is going to drop. See, the frame rate is at 13 now. But if we were to bake this, then the frame rates will increase and the animation will be a lot smoother in here. Because Blender's trying to work all of this trajectory out, right? Every time you make a change to it. So after it's done it once, it normally keeps that in a cache and then it will sort of be much clearer what's going on. So some other things in here that I use sometimes, let's see, I haven't really messed around with the physics types yet that much. So normally I just leave this on Newtonian. The mass of the object can affect the particle as well, right? So the more mass it has, the slower it will move, and the less effect the force fields will have on it. So if it has a very little mass, it should move a lot quicker. But at the same time, the force field should have less effect on them as well. So in here, let's have a look. So we set the gravity right down, right? If we set the gravity up, now you can see, because these particles have gravity, or the actual environment has gravity rather than the particles themselves, you can see you can create some interesting particle shapes as well just by changing the settings in here. And if you get the camera position quite right and you get everything set up quite nicely, you can do quite a nice little sort of animation. So if we were to go and click on the camera, for example, let's go to the camera, and if we were to move that camera, let's see, camera on the z-axis, if we were to move it down to like here, then you wouldn't see any of these particles getting emitted at the top. All you're going to see is this animation sequence at the bottom, all these particles flowing through. So it will look like this in the render, right? Which will be quite nice and quite interesting. Some sort of interesting shape of particles. We should probably move the camera, right? So on the x-axis, we can move it towards the center. So now these particles are sort of centered out. So that was quite interesting. We can go over to here and go over to the bloom. We can reduce or increase the bloom of the particles, so you can turn them all the way off, increase them a bit, change the radius. It's still quite, I mean 20,000 is quite a lot, right? So let's go back to our particle emitter, click here. Sometimes less is more, so if we set them to something like 1500, you can get to see a lot more of what's going on. The reason why these particles are sort of stopping like at a frame here is because their duration isn't long enough for it to finish off the sequence, right? So we've got two options. We can either reduce the lifetime of the particle, or we can tell Blender to render the particles a lot quicker, because right now it starts at frame 0 and the particles don't finish emitting at frame 200 here. You can see 200. So if we were to set this to frame like 50, the particles will get, all of the particles will get emitted a lot quicker. Can you see? Now Blender's got enough time for all them particles to flow through and probably flow out of the scene, but even then there's not enough time. So we could set this to something like 20 and go back to the first frame, and maybe Blender will have enough time, or there's enough time for all these particles to flow through and get to the end frame and flow out the frame. Probably still won't do that, right? Still not enough time. So one other tip, when you're working with particles like this and you've got a finite amount of time to work with, right? We've got 250 frames and you can see that the particles don't flow out totally. You can leave like the end frame, you can set this to something like 50, right? And it will never make that duration. But what you can do, and this is what I do sometimes, is I'll go to the first frame and hit the record button. Then you can go to the randoms, the scale here, and press the letter I. So we insert a keyframe for this scale at the beginning. Then we know that we've got only 250 frames to work with. So on frame 200 here, frame 200, I'll press the letter I again. So I've got a duration here set where the scale is always going to be set to this value here. Then I'll move all the way down to frame 250 and I'll press the letter I again, but this time I'll click inside of here and enter the value 0. So in effect, what is happening is Blender will render out these particles at that given size scale, but when it gets to frame 200, the particles are going to start to reduce in size, so they'll start to fade out like this. That way you can really now experiment and you can make sure the particles fade out in your scene. So if you had some text and some animation stuff going on, then you can have your particles fade out right at the end rather than them sort of rendering out. Well, let's move to here, somewhere like here. Like this will be your end frame. It won't look very good, right? But as we move across, they'll start to fade out like this. So that looks quite interesting already, right? So you should have a really good understanding of how these particles are working. You can now really go and experiment with the particles and create some really interesting stuff, right? You can experiment with them, and I'll be doing some more complex particle tutorials. I've been experimenting with particles. There's ways to control. You could have like 2 different particle emitters. You could have a circle over here and a circle here emitting particles, different number of particles, different colors, but also control how these force fields affect the particles for the ones on the left and the ones on the right individually, so you can control them separately. Then you can really do some interesting stuff. You can have particles flowing in different directions. You can really do some quite interesting particle effects where you can control how those particles work separately from 2 different sources, 2 different locations. But really today is just about giving you a fundamental understanding so you can go and experiment. You can use these now in sort of text animations or some animation sequence, right? You could add some text there and the particles could float down and float over the text. I will show you one other thing quickly. What we can do, just as an experiment, I'm going to turn back on the what's this called? The overlay. So we've got the overlay here, and our camera's positioned quite low, right? Our camera's down here, but I'm going to press Shift A, and I'm going to try and do this. Let's see. Let's press Shift A, and we're going to insert a plane. So just a plane, a simple plane. Let's zoom out a little bit here. So we've got this plane here. So we can see the particles. Let's turn on our, it might be worth going into, yeah, we'll leave it in render view for the minute. So the particles are getting emitted actually where this plane is at the moment, right? But they flow downwards to here. So we can see they're flowing in this downward trajectory. So what I want to do is grab this plane. We can press 7 on our keyboard, allows us to position this a bit better. Grab this plane and position it over the particles, and then I just want to scale it. So press S to scale, and I'm going to scale it up to around this size. Then I'll press number, let's see, we can just pan around actually, pan down here, and I want to move these particles to around here. We'll move the plane to here, so the particles are going to hit this plane. what I can do now is press 0 to see what the camera sees. We can zoom back in. We can move this down a little bit, actually, somewhere around here. The particles are going to flow down. I want them to hit this this surface and bounce off of it. So I can click on this plane, go to the physics, and set collision here. So I've told the particles to hit this surface and bounce off. So if we, let's see, we had the record button on at the moment, so we've got a frame here. Let's see what that is. This keyframe, we don't really need it, so I can just delete it, select it and delete it. We don't need that. That was a keyframe from this object, but the object's not moving or doing anything at the moment. So you can see that it's not really working at the moment, so I think we need to free the bake. So let's go to the let's click what have I done here? Let's see, plane. We set it to collision. So let's go to the particle settings, click on the particle emitter, and we might need to bake this first for this to work correctly. So let's bake it and click play. And now you can see they are actually bouncing off the object, because what we might need to do is increase the to see this properly. They are actually bouncing off, hitting this surface and bouncing off of it. It's a little bit hard to see because of this vortex and the wind settings and stuff. They're not really, and there's no gravity, right? There's very little gravity. So if we went to the particle emitter, go back to the particle settings, delete the bake, and if we were to give more velocity, so let's go to the velocity here. You can just about see it. I think if we were to move this up further, this plane, you would see it a bit more better. Let's turn off the overlays, maybe we'll see it a bit clearer what's going on. Yeah, they're dying so fast that you're not really seeing them bounce, right? And there's so many of them gathered in this location, you're not really seeing it too well. So what we can do is click on the overlay, pause it a second, and if we were to move this up to a higher location, let's try it from here. So let's go back, play. Now you can see them bouncing on the surface, not falling through, right? They're sitting on the surface here. So that's pretty cool. So we could click on this plane, go to the material, let's see, click new material, and then we could just set it to black. And then if we click on that material and turn off the specular, you won't even see it. So we could now zoom in to where these particles are, press Ctrl Alt 0, and now we can see what the camera sees. And this is what the camera is going to see, right? These particles flowing in like this, and then bouncing off of this surface that you don't really see in the render, but the particles will interact with it. They'll bounce off of it and do all that good stuff. So that's kind of how you do particle collision. Well, that's not how you. That's exactly how you do particle collisions. Sometimes I use that to in fact, I did a tutorial before with some spinning cog and some particle collisions in that particular tutorial, where the particles were hitting a spinning cog. So if you look at my YouTube channel, you'll see that tutorial there. So that's pretty much it. That's quite a basic tutorial for working with particles in Blender. I will be doing some more complex ones, but really now it's time for you to go and experiment. One thing you can do is to experiment with this, you can click on things like turbulence, for example, and you can go down to the settings here on the physics, and you can just change the type of force field it is. So you can go and do things like set it to something like let's see, Leonard Jones. So now you set it to a complete, it's no longer turbulence, although it's called turbulence, it's no longer that. It's called turbulence here, but it's set to Leonard Jones, so it's set to a completely different thing. Now you can see the particles are behaving differently. If we were to go back and set it to turbulence, let's set it to turbulence here. Now you can see the particles are doing different things. So you can experiment with them. So I would normally set something up like this, just play around with the settings, get it to something I like, where you're just experimenting, and then change the settings. You can click on the vortex here and change that one to the Lennard-Jones. Now you can see a completely different effect on the particles. You can see that, right? So now you can actually see the collision much more clearer. What's going on with the collision? It's bouncing off. Some of them are falling past because this plane wasn't that big, right? The plane itself wasn't covering all of the surface. See, we could click on the plane, press. In fact, we'll leave it like that. I'm fine with it like that. So only some of them are hitting the surface. But that's down to the vortex. We changed it from a vortex to a Lennard-Jones. So we change it back to the vortex. We'll get our animation back to as it was originally. And you can add more fields as well. You can add other ones to it. So we could add a Lennard-Jones to it. So we can press Shift A, go to the force field, Lennard-Jones. We can add one of those in, and then we can experiment with that. And now we've got 3 different force fields. So we've got a field Lennard here, Lennard-Jones. Go to its settings. Normally the strength on these are set quite low, so you won't really see the effect that it has until you increase the strength and experiment with it. And where it's positioned also affects it. So we click here. Let's press number 7. So number 7 will take us into the top view. Let's click on that Lennard-Jones, turn off the animation, and we can drag that Lennard-Jones, so it's sitting over the particles here. Then press number 3, we see it on the side view, and drag it down so it's right where the particles are doing its thing. Press 0, and then we can see what effect it has. And for I understand, like the Lennard-Jones is kind of like pulling the particles to its location. That's kind of what it does. You can experiment with them. The particles will get pulled to that particular location. But you need to really read up on Blender. I won't say I'm a particle expert yet, but it's all good fun, right? We're just learning. So best way to learn, I always believe, is to experiment. Go and play around with settings, see what they do, experiment with all of these. You've got force fields here. There's a magnet as well. Where's the magnet gone? Magnet. You can see the magnet does something pretty dramatic, but that's because it's got quite a lot of strength. So the magnet should pull objects towards it, I believe. So we set this to like 1. The objects now getting pulled much faster to this magnet force field here. So if we set it to a minus value, it should repel it in theory. See, now you can see it there. It's trying to push the particles away, but the strength isn't that much, so they're not getting pushed too far. We set it to a higher value, like -6. Now you can see the particles are getting pushed up here, and the magnet's down here. So these particles are getting pushed away, and they're going to take a lot longer to drop down. So you can experiment with this stuff. Maybe set it to like 0.12. And this all has an effect on these particles. So I'll leave you to go and experiment. Let's just go to File, Save. By no means is this is particularly the way I would set up particles. Maybe it's okay actually for maybe some sort of text animation. You can do really whatever you want. So you've got a good understanding of how particles work in Blender now, and that's your time to go and experiment. Hopefully you can come up with some nice examples of using particles. I'll leave you to go and experiment with that. That's the end of this tutorial. So we'll go to File, Save. We'll close this, and I look forward to seeing you in the next DCP Wave tutorial.